Hey everybody, welcome to another lesson of learning Japanese. Today we're covering another pretty simple grammar pattern, and that is just going to be using any given noun with the word shidai to basically mean depending on that noun. So basically the word shidai is going to translate to something along the lines of dependent upon. So if we use that combined with a noun, it's basically going to translate, non-surprisingly, to dependent on that noun. And so with this grammar pattern, we can basically say that a noun is dependent on this noun, or we can say that an action is dependent on this noun, and in those cases we would use right after the word shidai, da or des or de respectively. As I've said in a previous video, by now we should be pretty aware that da or des is going to bring about an end to a clause, and de is going to be kind of an instrument marker for actions / verbs to express the means in which that verb occurred or was performed. And so with that, let's just jump into some example sentences because those will definitely give us a better idea of how this works. So for our first example sentence using a noun plus the word shidai, we have the line Raishuu no shiken no muzukashisa wa sensei shidai desu. And what this line will translate to basically is just the difficulty of next week's test depends on our teacher. Let's break down the sentence bit by bit. First up, we have this double instance of a noun modification. So we have Raishuu, which means next week. We have the particle no, we have shiken, which means test, and then we have the particle no again, and then we have the word muzukashisa, which is going to be the e adjective muzukashi, which means hard, turned into a noun, so it kind of means hardness or difficulty. And so those three words together, linked by the particles no, Raishuu no shiken no muzukashisa, is going to be the difficulty of next week's test. We're going to mark that, the difficulty of next week's test, as the topic of the sentence, so we mark it with the particle wa. Then this is where we use the grammar pattern, and it's simply going to be sensei, which means teacher, and then we have shidai desu. And so that's going to be depends on teacher. And more naturally, this whole sentence will be the difficulty of next week's test depends on our teacher. Raishuu no shiken no muzukashisa wa sensei shidai desu. For our next example sentence, we'll use this grammar pattern with a verb. So for our line, we haveこのライブは観客のエネルギー次第で長くなれる. And what this line will translate to is just basically this concert can go on long depending on the crowd's energy. Let's break down the sentence bit by bit. First up, we have the word kono, which means this. Right after that, we have raibu, which is going to be live, which will more naturally translate to concert, basically. We have the particle wa marking the concert as the topic of the sentence. We have kankyaku, which means crowd or audience. We have the noun of a noun modification here, so kankyaku no. And then we have the word energy, which means energy. So the crowd's energy, and this is what we're going to use the grammar pattern on, so depends on the crowd's energy is going to be kankyaku no energy shidai. Right after shidai, we're going to put the particle de because we're going to be using this to modify a verb basically. And the action is going to be nagaku nareru, and nagaku of course is the adverbial form of the e adjective nagai, which means long. And right after that is the verb naru, which means to become. Then we conjugate that into the potential form, so is able to become, or can become, so can become long. And so we put that all together and it translates to this concert can go on longer depending on the crowd's energy. このライブは観客のエネルギー次第で長くなれる. For our next example sentence, we're going to go back to using this to modify another noun. So for our line, we have 次の試合が勝てるかどうかはチームワーク次第だ. And what this line will translate to is just basically whether or not we can win the next match depends on our teamwork. Let's break down the sentence bit by bit. First up, we have Tsugi, which means next. We have no, this is going to be the noun of a noun modification. Right after no, we have shiai, which means match. So Tsugi no shiai is going to be basically the next match. We have the particle ga modifying shiai because we are going to be using a verb in its potential form. So that's what we're going to use to mark the direct object of a potential form verb. And the verb that we're using is the verb katsu, which means to win. We're going to conjugate that into its potential form, so katsu turns into kateru. Right after kateru, we have kadoka, and this is going to be basically changing it into a question that is going to translate to kind of a whether or not question. So whether or not we can win the next match, sugi no shiai ga kateru kadoka. Now we're going to mark that question itself as basically the topic of the sentence, so we follow that with wa. So here you can see that we're basically turning that whole question into a quote that acts as a noun basically. So we're basically saying this noun, which is representing the quote, is dependent on another noun, which is going to be teamwork. So whether or not we can win the next match depends on our teamwork. Sugi no shiai ga kateru ka douka wa chimuoku shidai da. For our last example sentence, we have the line 自分の考え方は他の人々の影響次第で深くなる. And what this line will translate to is just basically your own way of thinking becomes deeper depending on other people's So let's break down the sentence bit by bit. First up, we have jibun, which means yourself, basically. We're going to be employing the noun of a noun modification, so we have the particle no right after that. Then right after the no, we have the word kangaekata, which means way of thinking or manner of thinking, basically. So jibun no kangaekata is your own manner of thinking, your own way of thinking. We're going to mark that as the topic of the sentence, so right after that we put the particle wa. Now we're going to use the grammar pattern, so we're going to provide our first noun, which is going to be hoka no hitobito no eikyo, and this is a double instance of the noun of a noun modification. So first up we have hoka, which means other. We have the particle no, then we have the word hitobito, which means people, so other people. Then we have the particle no again. This is the second instance of the noun of a noun modification. Then we have eikyo, which translates to influence. So altogether, hoka no hitobito no eikyo is the influence of other people or other people's influence. And so this influence is going to be the thing that we're going to use with the grammar pattern. So right after eikyo, we put shidai, which means depends on. So depends on other people's influence. And then right after shidai, we're going to use the particle da this time around because we're using this to modify a verb, basically. And so the verb phrase that we have is going to be fukaku naru, and fukaku is going to be the adverbial form of the e adjective fukai, which means deep. And then of course naru means to become, so becomes deep. So we combine that with the rest of the sentence and it translates to your own way of thinking becomes deep depending on other people's influence. Jibun no kangaekata wa hoka no hitobito no eikyo shidai de fukaku naru. And so yeah, that's how we're using the word shidai, which basically means dependent upon, and we use it with a noun to basically express that something is dependent on said noun. And that particular thing can be another noun in and of itself, or it can be kind of a verb, an action that depends on a noun and such and such. And so yeah, it's a pretty simple grammar pattern. All we really have to do is add the word shidai right after a noun, followed by whichever particle we need to use, and we can say exactly what we want to say.